On the day Red Butte raised the price of flour again, Lydia Mercer spent almost every coin she had on 4 ewes that looked too poor to survive the winter. Her 10-year-old son stared at the flour sacks she did not buy. The sheep were thin, 2 were close to lambing. One had a teat scarred from an old injury. If Lydia was wrong, they would eat through the hay before they gave anything back. She took the rope anyway. By January, when the wagon road disappeared beneath snow, people in Red Butte would be paying for food made from the animals the auctioneer could barely give away. 3 months earlier, Lydia had not been trying to start a dairy. She was 34 years old. She was trying to keep a roof, a boy, and 1 winter's worth of food from slipping apart at the same time. Her place sat on Juniper Bench, a dry rise several miles outside Red Butte in southern Idaho Territory. The cabin was small, the shed leaned east in a hard wind, and the ground produced more dust than generosity unless water was carried to it. Lydia's husband, Samuel, had died the previous spring when a loaded wagon rolled on a steep grade. He had been gone long enough for the neighbors to stop bringing food, but not long enough for Lydia to stop reaching for the second coat peg by the door. What Samuel left was useful but incomplete. A cabin, a half-fenced patch of ground, a handcart, 2 axes, a little barley, a stack of meadow hay that looked respectable until Lydia began dividing it by the number of cold days ahead, and Caleb, at 10, her son, was old enough to understand when money was short and young enough to believe adults could somehow make more appear. Lydia had $12.30 in a cloth purse the morning they rode into Red Butte. She meant to buy flour, lamp oil, salt, and perhaps a little coffee if the arithmetic permitted it. Then the auction started behind the freight yard. A sheep outfit east of town had broken apart after its owner died. The sound animals sold first. Young wethers moved quickly. Strong ewes went to ranchers who knew what they wanted. At the end, 4 females remained tied together near the fence. The auctioneer called them a lot because no one wanted to bid by the head. Lydia stopped. Caleb did not. "Ma, the flour. I know." The first ewe had good feet and a narrow frame under too much wool. The second was older, but her teeth still met well enough to graze. The third carried her lamb low and heavy. The fourth had a flattened scar along one side of the udder, but the other side was soft and clean. None had the nasal discharge Lydia feared. None staggered. Their eyes followed feed. They were poor, they were not finished. The auctioneer saw her looking and laughed without much humor. "They'll cost you more in hay than they're worth in meat," Lydia asked when they had last been bred. That changed his expression. He checked the estate list. 3 were believed to be carrying lambs. The 4th might be. Caleb touched Lydia's sleeve. "We can't eat sheep milk today." "No," she said, "we can't. That was the danger in the choice. Flour solved tonight." The ewes might solve nothing at all. Lydia had grown up on a mixed farm in eastern Iowa, where her mother pressed small cheeses whenever milk outran the household. They had not kept many sheep, but Lydia knew enough to understand the arithmetic hidden inside a live female animal. A ewe could turn forage a person could not eat into milk. Milk could become curd. Curd, if it was handled correctly, could become food that lasted longer than milk ever would. But only if the animals survived. Only if the lamb survived. Only if the milk came. Only if Lydia still remembered what her hands had once known. The first bid was $8 for all 4. No one answered. The auctioneer lowered it. Lydia raised her hand at $9.50. A butcher across the pen offered 10. She went to $10.75. He shook his head. The hammer came down. After the fee, Lydia had less than $1.50 left. Caleb looked at the sheep, then toward the general store. Lydia handed him the small sack of salt she could still afford. "We're walking home," she said. The flour stayed in Red Butte. The 4 ewes did not. The first week proved Caleb's objection better than Lydia wanted to admit. The sheep ate. They ate the soft meadow hay first, then nosed past the coarser stems as if insulted by them. Lydia could not allow that. She began mixing the better hay with barley straw and chaff, forcing the animals to work through the whole ration instead of choosing the sweetest mouthfuls. She traded 2 days of washing at the stage station for a wagon bed of alfalfa sweepings. She repaired a neighbor's canvas harness cover for 3 sacks of barley hulls. She sent Caleb along the irrigation ditch after school hours to gather fallen willow leaves before they blew away. Nothing in the feed pile looked like prosperity. Together it was enough to make the ewes lift their heads faster when Lydia entered the shed. She watched droppings, appetite, feet, breathing, and the softening hollows beside their tails. She ran her hands under the wool to judge flesh where the eye could lie. The oldest ewe improved first. Caleb named her Button because one ear curled inward like a bent button hook. Lydia pretended not to approve of names for animals that might have to be sold. By the third day she was calling her Button too. The nights sharpened. Frost silvered the water bucket. Lydia moved the ewes into the least drafty side of the shed and hung old sacking across the gaps between boards, leaving the upper space open so damp air could escape. She had seen more animals weakened by wet bedding than by cold air alone. Feed remained the larger problem. Every armful Lydia carried to the rack was an armful no longer available for January. One evening Caleb found her standing beside the haystack with a piece of charcoal in her hand. She had drawn short marks on the shed post, one for each ration left if the weather stayed ordinary. "How many?" he asked. Lydia looked at the marks. "Enough if nothing goes wrong." Caleb knew what that meant. Something always went wrong. It began with the third ewe. She went off feed just before dawn and pawed at the bedding. Lydia watched from the doorway while Caleb held the lantern. The ewe rose, turned, lay down, then rose again. Lydia waited. A small water bag appeared. Then 2 feet. The lamb came without help, slick and trembling in the straw. The ewe turned at once and began cleaning it. Caleb grinned. Then a second set of feet appeared. The grin vanished. The second lamb was smaller. It came quickly, but it did not try to rise. Lydia cleared its nose and rubbed the ribs with a rough towel until the chest began moving with more force. The ewe licked the first lamb and ignored the second. Lydia pushed the weak twin toward the udder. The ewe stepped away. They tried again. Same result. For the next hour, Lydia kept the lamb warm inside her coat while Caleb held the ewe in a corner. When the lamb finally found the teat, it sucked only a little before its head dropped. There would be no cheese from that milk. Not yet. The first milk belonged to the lambs, and Lydia knew it. For 2 days she brought the smaller twin to the ewe again and again. Caleb took the dawn turn before chores. Lydia took the late one after washing and mending were finished. The lamb strengthened. The other ewes began lambing over the next 10 days. One produced a single strong ram lamb. Button delivered twins. The fourth, the ewe with the damaged teat, delivered one small ewe lamb and accepted it immediately. By then, the feed marks on the post had shortened faster than Lydia liked. But the animals had changed the arithmetic. There were lambs on the bedding. There was milk in the udders. And after each lamb had nursed, there was sometimes a little milk left for Lydia. The first evening she carried a half pail into the cabin. Caleb looked at it as if it were money. Lydia did not. Milk spoiled. That was the whole problem. She warmed it slowly, remembering her mother's rule that a cheesemaker should never trust a pot just because the fire looked small. She had no dairy thermometer. She tested heat with a clean finger and watched how steam behaved along the edge. Her rennet was the greater uncertainty. Years earlier, a traveling butcher had shown Samuel how to dry a strip from a calf's stomach for cheesemaking. A small piece remained wrapped in salt in the pantry. Lydia soaked it and used the liquid the way she remembered. Nothing happened. The milk stayed nearly as loose as before. She waited. Still loose. Caleb leaned over the table. "Is it supposed to look like that?" "No." Lydia hated the answer because the milk had cost feed. She added more rennet water and warmed the pot again. The curd finally formed, but unevenly. Some clumps tightened like rubber while thin milk still moved between them. She drained what she could through cloth. The result was edible, but it was not a wheel she could age. It was a wet, grainy mass that needed to be eaten at once. They ate it with boiled barley that night. Caleb did not complain. The next morning Lydia changed the experiment. She did not risk another full pail. She filled 4 cups with the same amount of warm milk and added different measured spoonfuls of rennet water to each. Then she watched the clock on the mantel. 1 cup set too slowly, 1 tightened too fast, 2 formed a clean break she could lift with the edge of a spoon. The old rennet had not failed completely. Her guess had. The second batch set better. Lydia cut the curd in the pot and stirred gently until the pieces stopped smearing against one another. She drained them, then salted heavily because she feared spoilage more than she feared dryness. The curd tasted sharp and clean. It also refused to knit. Under pressure, the pieces held for a day. Then the edge cracked. When Lydia cut the little wheel, the center crumbled into salty grains. Caleb picked up a piece, better than the first. "Still wrong. Can we eat wrong again?" That made her laugh for the first time in several days. They ate the mistake. On the third try, Lydia salted less in the curd and moved more of the salt to a brine after pressing. She built a simple lever press against the shed wall using a sound plank, a stone weight, and a peg Samuel had once used for wagon work. She wrapped the curd in cloth, pressed it lightly, turned it, pressed again, then increased the weight only after the surface had begun to close. This time the wheel came out smooth, not perfect. Smooth. She set it on a board in the coolest corner of the pantry. For 3 days she turned it. The rind dried. For 5 days she watched for swelling. None came. On the 8th day she cut it. The interior was pale and close, with no wet pocket trapped in the center. It bent slightly before breaking. Caleb waited beside the table. Lydia handed him the first slice. He chewed. "It tastes like something we could sell." Lydia tried the second slice. For once her son was right before she was willing to say it. The station kitchen bought the remaining piece. May Avery ran the kitchen at the Red Butte stage stop with the patience of a woman who had fed too many travelers who believed shouting made supper arrive faster. She took Lydia's cheese, cut off a thin piece, and tasted it without expression. Then she cut another. "How much can you make?" "Not much yet." "That's not what I asked." Lydia looked at the wheel. "Maybe 2 this week, smaller than this one." May counted coins onto the table. "Bring them." That first sale did not save Lydia. It did something more useful. It proved there was a buyer. The next problem appeared because there was a buyer. Lydia could make cheese faster than she could keep it. Her cabin pantry was cold before sunrise and warm after the stove had been running. Wheels near the outer wall dried on one side. Wheels nearer the kitchen softened when cooking went on for hours. A rind that looked sound in the morning could feel greasy by evening. The Ewes had created a new kind of risk. Milk was no longer the scarce thing. Steady conditions were. Lydia began walking the property with a cup of water and a shovel. Below the bench, where willow roots darkened the soil, a small spring seeped from the base of a basalt shelf. In summer it fed a narrow green strip before disappearing into gravel. In autumn the water stayed cold enough to numb Lydia's fingers. Samuel had once talked about building a trough there. He never had. Lydia stood beside the spring and looked uphill toward the cabin. Then she looked at the ground around the seep. A buried storage room would have required digging deep into hard soil she could barely break. The spring offered something else, cold water that moved. She decided to build around it. The first version was barely a building. Lydia and Caleb laid fieldstone into a low rectangle around the spring, leaving the water a clear path through the middle. They roofed the space with poles, rough boards, and a thick layer of sod. Above the water channel, Lydia set wooden shelves on stone supports. The idea was simple. The spring would keep the small room cooler than the cabin. The flowing water would carry heat away. Shade would do the rest. Silas Webb, a neighboring rancher, came down to see what they were doing. He squatted beside the water and shook his head. "You built a house for cheese. A cold one, I hope." Silas looked at the damp stone. "Hope doesn't dry walls." Lydia knew better than to dismiss a warning just because she did not like it. She raised the lowest shelf another handspan before putting any wheel inside. For the first week, the springhouse seemed to work. The air stayed cool through the afternoon. The wheels dried more evenly. Lydia could cook in the cabin without thinking about what heat was doing to the cheese. Then an autumn storm hit the bench. Rain came hard against ground too dry to drink it quickly. Water ran off the slope in sheets. By morning, the spring was carrying silt. The shallow outlet below Lydia's stone wall clogged with leaves and gravel. The water rose. When Lydia opened the springhouse door, the lowest shelf was wet. 2 wheels had absorbed moisture through their cloth wraps. One smelled sour at the edge. The other had begun to soften underneath. Caleb stood behind her. "Can we save them?" Lydia pressed a thumb against the first rind. "Not these." She carried both outside and cut them open. The damage was worse near the bottom. The curd itself had not been flooded, but the air had become so wet that the rind stopped protecting it. She lost nearly a week of milk. Silas came by that afternoon and saw the discarded wheels. He did not say he had warned her. He picked up a shovel. That was better. They rebuilt the water path first. Instead of letting the spring spread broadly beneath the room, Lydia narrowed it through a stone-lined channel. She dug an overflow trench outside the downhill wall so storm water had somewhere else to go before it rose under the racks. Caleb laid flat rock over the splashiest section. Lydia moved every shelf higher and left open space around all 4 sides. Then she added 2 small vents under the eaves, one low and one high enough to let warm, damp air escape. The springhouse did not need to be dry like a flour bin. It needed not to be saturated. That difference cost her 2 wheels to understand. The next rain was smaller. Lydia watched the outlet in the dark with a lantern. Water moved through the channel and into the overflow without touching the shelves. Inside, the rinds stayed firm. She let herself believe the room might work, not because it had worked once, because it had survived the thing that had broken it before. The first hard frost gave her another test. The cabin pantry swung from icy before dawn to warm after breakfast, but the little springhouse changed slowly. Lydia placed one bowl of water near the door and another above the channel. The first skimmed with ice at the edge overnight. The second did not. She moved the cheese farther from the door, tightened the latch, and kept the upper vent barely open. The point was not to make the room colder. It was to keep sudden weather from reaching the wheels faster than the spring could steady the air. By late autumn, Lydia was delivering small pressed wheels to May Avery twice a week. The station cook served slices with beans, bread, and cold meat. Freight drivers began buying wedges for the road because the cheese kept better than fresh milk and traveled more easily than butter. That brought Parker Klein to Lydia's door. Parker ran Red Butte's general store and trusted food only after he had watched it sit. He turned one of Lydia's wheels over in his hands. "May says this keeps. It does if it's kept cool and dry. Everybody says their food keeps until somebody pays for it." Lydia almost took the wheel back. Instead, she said, "Keep it 2 weeks. Cut it after. Pay me if you still want the next one." Parker agreed. The test mattered more than praise. For 14 days the wheel sat in his storeroom, away from the stove. He turned it once because Lydia told him to. On the 15th morning he cut through the rind. No wet seam opened, no sour pocket released gas. The paste was firm. Parker tasted it and wrote an order for 3 more. Lydia read the order, then folded it. "I can bring 2. Parker looked up. "I asked for 3. My sheep didn't." That was the limit she refused to hide. 4 ewes were not a factory. Lambs still needed milk. Feed still cost labor. An animal could go dry. A bad wheel could erase days of work. Lydia could sell only what the flock produced without weakening the animals that had to survive winter. Parker changed the order to 2. The choice cost Lydia money that week. It probably saved her more later. Caleb wanted to sell the ram lambs as soon as buyers began asking. Lydia sold 2 and kept 1 ewe lamb from Button and 1 from the scarred ewe. "More mouths," Caleb said when he saw her decision. "Next year, more milk, if we feed them until next year." Lydia looked at him. "Now you sound like the auctioneer." He smiled, but only a little. He had learned enough to know she had not won yet. The money from cheese went first to hay, then lamp oil, then flour. Lydia did not buy anything that looked like success. She bought time. By December, 26 small wheels had passed through the springhouse. Some had gone to the stage stop, some to Parker. A few had been bartered directly to ranch families for grain, cordwood, or cloth. 3 had failed badly enough to be discarded. Several more were eaten at home because their rinds cracked or their texture came out uneven. The losses never disappeared. They became part of the method. Lydia tested every new rennet, soaking in a cup before risking a pail. She marked brine strength by taste and by how the rind changed after a day. She no longer trusted the springhouse after rain without checking the overflow first. She did not put a fresh wheel on a shelf simply because there was space. Every correction had a reason. That was why the work held together. Then the cold came hard. The first storm buried the road in a night. Wind crossed Juniper Bench without anything tall enough to slow it. Snow packed into the gaps around the shed. The temperature fell far enough for the water bucket inside the cabin to skim with ice near the wall. Lydia moved the sheep deeper into shelter and hung another layer of sacking across the open side. She increased their hay, not because she had extra, but because cold demanded it. The stage road closed before noon. A freight wagon made Red Butte and stopped there. Another turned back. Travelers who had expected to keep moving began crowding May Avery's kitchen. Fresh milk became difficult to handle. Eggs froze in some outbuildings. Meat could be kept cold easily, but getting more of it into town was another matter. Parker still had Lydia's wheels. May had 4. For the first time, the food Lydia had been making for a future sale became food the town needed because the future had arrived as weather. On the second night, the wind shifted and drove snow hard against the downhill side of the springhouse. Lydia checked it before bed. The room was cold but not frozen. The spring water still moved beneath the shelves. She slept 3 hours. Then something woke her. Not a crash, the absence of a sound. The spring had a faint, constant run she could hear from the doorway when the night was still enough. Now she heard only wind. Lydia pulled on her boots. Caleb sat up from his blanket. "What is it?" "The outlet." They opened the cabin door and snow came through it sideways. The rope line from the cabin to the shed was still visible for the first few yards. Beyond that, the yard had disappeared. Lydia tied another rope around her waist and fixed the free end to the porch post. Caleb grabbed his coat. "I'm coming, you're holding the line. Ma, if I fall, you pull, that's the job." He did not argue again. Lydia moved into the storm. The springhouse door was half buried. She cleared it with the shovel, forced it open, and lowered the lantern. Water was spreading across the floor. The outlet had iced where the channel left the wall. Snow had packed against the overflow trench. The spring itself had not stopped. It was backing up. The bottom shelf was still above the water, for the moment. Lydia crawled to the outlet and drove the shovel blade into the packed snow outside. The first cut did nothing. The second opened only a narrow groove. Water touched the sole of her boot. She dug faster. The rope at her waist pulled tight when she slipped. For a second she was on one knee with icy water against her skirt. Caleb hauled from the cabin side. Lydia regained her footing. Then the shovel broke through the packed ridge. A dark line of water moved. It widened. The backed-up spring spilled into the trench and ran away beneath the snow. Inside the springhouse, the water level began dropping. Lydia stood there, breathing hard, one hand on the stone wall. The shelves had stayed dry. The wheels were safe. But the lesson was not that the springhouse could survive anything. The opposite was true. It survived because Lydia kept checking the weak place she already knew existed. By dawn, the storm had erased her shovel marks. The outlet still ran. Red Boot remained cut off for 4 days. May Avery stretched what she had. Beans, salt pork, bread while flour lasted. Lydia's cheese went out in thick slices to drivers sleeping on benches and families who had come in from isolated claims. Parker sold wedges until only 2 wheels remained on his shelf. Nobody called the cheese a miracle. It was food. That was enough. On the 5th morning, the sky cleared blue and hard. Men began opening the road with teams and shovels. The first wagon through brought no great celebration, only sacks, mail, and news from the next station. Lydia walked into town 2 days later with Caleb beside her and 3 new wheels wrapped in clean cloth. Parker saw them through the store window. "Thought you'd keep those for yourself after this week." "I kept enough." He weighed the first wheel. May came in through the side door carrying an empty basket. "Tell me there's one for the kitchen." Lydia pointed to the smallest. "That one." May put down the basket and paid before asking the price. The same week, Lydia bought a full sack of flour, a tin of lamp oil, and a pair of heavy boots for Caleb. Then she spent more than all 3 purchases combined on hay. Caleb looked at the wagon load. "There goes the cheese money." Lydia shook her head. "There it is." The hay was not what remained after success. It was what made the next batch possible. Winter did not become easy. The ewes still needed feeding before daylight. The springhouse outlet still iced during hard freezes. One lamb developed a cough and had to be moved away from the draft. A January wheel cracked because Lydia pressed it too dry. 2 orders went unfilled when Button's milk dropped. But Lydia was no longer making decisions one emergency at a time. Feed became milk. Milk became curd. Curd became a wheel that could wait. The springhouse gave that wheel steady cold. The store and stage stop turned waiting food back into flour, hay, lamp oil, and boots. Each part supported the next. By February, Parker stopped asking whether the cheese would keep. He asked when the next 2 would arrive. Silas Webb built a smaller spring box beside his own seat for butter and eggs. May began saving clean cloth for Lydia instead of throwing worn flour sacking into the rag bin. 2 ranch wives came to Juniper Bench one afternoon to watch Lydia test a rennet cup before setting a full pail. Lydia showed them the cup. Then she showed them the cracked wheel from January. "This one is the useful part," she said. One woman looked puzzled. "The bad one?" "The reason the next one wasn't." That was as close as Lydia came to giving a speech about what the winter had taught her. She did not need one. The proof sat on the shelf. When the thaw finally came, snowmelt ran down Juniper Bench and filled every shallow track in the yard. Lydia walked to the springhouse expecting trouble. Caleb followed with the shovel. The overflow trench was clear. The water level held where it should. Inside, the newest wheels rested above the channel on dry boards. Caleb crouched near the wall and listened. Below them, cold water moved through stone and out toward the open ground. All winter, almost everything on the bench had frozen, stalled, or waited. The water under Lydia's cheese shelves had kept moving.